Pastor Jory, I'm going to challenge you for next week to preach from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 4, verses 9 through 15. It's your turn to preach, tag, you're it.
Hey Nick, really enjoyed your message last week, and I know you challenged me with Ezekiel, chapter 4, verses 9 through 15, so let's dig into there right now. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day, and eat it at set times. Also, measure out a sixth of a hin of water and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a barley cake. Bake it in the sight of the people using human excrement for fuel. The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them. Then I said, not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now, I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No unclean meat has ever entered my mouth. Very well, he said. I will let you bake your bread over cow manure instead of human excrement. Well, thank you for that, Nick. So I know you've probably been to the store and seen the Ezekiel bread in the bread aisle. It amazes me that that's really a thing. But I do know they don't actually cook it over, manure or human excrement at all. But they're just kind of like joining up as much of the grains and the barley and all that stuff as much as possible, and making it for people to be looking very biblical, I guess. But this really isn't a recommendation to just for anybody to eat. This has a very specific reason for being here. Now, Ezekiel, we have to understand, Ezekiel's living at a time of a lot of changes in the political atmosphere. We know he's writing probably in Babylon, but he's writing this at a time that this has already taken place. He's writing about his time in Jerusalem. The first 7 chapters we see in Ezekiel are kind of giving us this inaugural address, almost like saying, this is how I've been called to be a prophet, and this is what I've been called to do. And those are the first 7 chapters. So we're kind of like right in the middle of this whole time. We're kind of right here in the middle during his call to observe and be a watchman over the people. So he's observing everything that's happening. Now, this is also, the year we're looking at is around 593. He starts his ministry. We also know he's about 30 years old at this point, and he is a priest in the temple of Jerusalem. So we also know, based on dating, he probably heard some of the other prophets, like Jeremiah or even Habakkuk. Jeremiah preached inside the temple. Jeremiah was also a priest. So he probably knew Jeremiah, or at least knew of him and heard his messages. And so we'll see a lot of similarities between what Jeremiah is calling us to do to what Ezekiel is almost demonstrating what's going to happen. In Ezekiel chapter 4, from the very beginning of this chapter is very important, because this bread making thing isn't the only thing God's calling him to do. The first thing God's calling him to do in chapter 4 is to get a brick and engrave in it a picture of Jerusalem. I can't imagine this looking super great, but at least some of the basic symbols and structures that people could recognize it being Jerusalem is what he's laying on top of. Again, he's supposed to lay on top of it on his side. So I've got a terrible back nowadays, and so just imagining that causes me a little bit of pain. And he's supposed to do this for 390 days. And then he's supposed to flip over and do it for another 40. Ow. Each day is to represent a year. And the first 390 is to represent the exile for the northern kingdom, and the last 40 are to show the exile of the southern kingdom. And he's laying on top this entire time, and during this time, God gives him what he's supposed to be eating and drinking. He's supposed to drink only about 2/3 of a quart of water every day. That's not a lot. That's a little more than half a liter. So if you get like one of those soda bottles, those liter silver bottles, drink a little bit more than half, and that's all you're allowed to have all day. That's not a lot, especially whenever you're laying in the street, uh, cooking your own bread every day as well. And what this bread's supposed to consist of is all symbolic. All these different types of grains, the lentils, the spelt, the barley, the wheat, all this is to show that some of these are good for making bread. Some of them not so much. The idea is you don't have enough of one to make an entire loaf. Which I know during quarantine, like I know a lot of people started making sourdough bread around here. I have not, unfortunately, but I know a lot of people started making bread, and it doesn't take a whole bunch of flour to make bread, but it does take some. And this is all showing us that there's not enough of any single type of grain to make even a single loaf of bread. There's not enough. Resources are scarce. And so he is supposed to bake this bread using all these different types of wheats and barleys and lentils and millets and spelts and trying to make something edible. Again, showing the intense scarcity of resources and showing how disastrous it's going to be during a siege of Jerusalem by Babylon, as well as how bad it's going to be for when they leave and are exiled from Judah. All this is to be symbolic of what's to come. And so that alone is not really pleasant to do. You can't imagine that being very fun to have to make your own bread out of these little tiny bits of materials, mixing it all together and hoping you get, a good batch. Maybe you get a really, really millet batch and it's really bad. But it's going to be random too. And then not having a lot of water for the day. So if you have a really bad and dry piece of bread that day, you're not going to be able to really wash it down much. It's going to just be hanging in your mouth all day. It's going to be uncomfortable. That alone is bad enough. But now put yourself on top of a brick as well for the next year and a half. Even worse. But it doesn't stop there. The next portion, God then says, and you're going to bake it using human excrement. Ew. Alright? Ew. That's disgusting. We don't do that. Humanity, we do not like to use that. Just don't do that. This is, again, not a recommendation of how you are to eat bread. Not a recommendation on how to make bread. Don't do it. This was a very specific message for a very specific time. Don't. But, what is this trying to show us? This is trying to show us that you're going to be in such dire straits. You're going to use your own feces as fuel. And at all this, Ezekiel's finally like, okay, no, I can't. The brick thing I can do, all right? I can be dirty physically. I've been that before. I was a child. I can't, but I've never eaten anything unclean. Remember, he's a priest. He's 30 years old. His entire time growing up as a Levite, that means all the priests of the temple and their families are getting to eat the sacrifices, parts of the sacrifices that the people are given. So all of that stuff is already pure, that stuff's already clean. He's never had to worry about it as a child because everyone took care of that for him. But then when he got older, he did take care of it. And he's still taking care of himself. He was still eating correctly to the Jewish law of how to remain ritually clean compared to like what most people today eat. Ritual cleanliness, again, we don't need to follow it. It's not for us. But it was important for that time. And so this is what breaks him. This is what he says, no, I can't do that. I can do uncomfortable bricklaying, I can do being dirty on the outside, but don't make me eat things that are also unclean. And God relents. God says, okay, fine, use cow manure instead. Still not good. Still not a good thing that I would recommend people to do. But we do know, like, think of history books. Think of, like, whenever you've listened to, like, teachers in high school and middle school talk about, like, the journey west for, like, the American expansion. The people moving west, they used cow manure as fuel. This is a common thing that happened for people. It was readily available, and it gave off enough heat to be able to cook food or give enough heat to survive a snowstorm. So this idea is not new. This is actually very common for this time. In time of scarcity, you use cow manure. This is something Jeremiah will still do reluctantly, I'm sure, but it's at least better. But again, all of this is to show the intense scarcity of resources for the people of Israel during a time of besiegement by Babylon, as well as what is going to happen once they're exiled. God even answers like our often question for prophets of what's the point of this. He says, this is to show you will be defiled by eating defiled things in defiled ways when you're kicked out of this land. This is an intense thing. He's showing people that it's going to be uncomfortable. Now, that's the context of this text. That is how we're supposed to understand it a little bit. But why would we really read this? Other than, like, knowing a little more about this time period and knowing what some of the prophets said. Like, why else would we read it? How can we apply this today? Does this mean this is how we are supposed to eat bread? Is this how much water we're supposed to eat a day or drink a day? No. Again, no, don't do it. Don't cook bread using human feces. Don't do it. This is to show us that God's going to call us to be uncomfortable. This is to show us that God is going to call the people into ministry, into a Christian life, into just following Him, into learning more about Him. That entire process is going to be uncomfortable. We're going to be confronted with things that we think are right and good, and God's going to say, well, I need you to do something else right now. What He's asking Ezekiel to do isn't harming anybody else. So I don't want you to think that, like, God says love your neighbor, but right now He's telling me I should punch you in the face. No, that's not what He's saying at all. We understand this to say God's telling us to love our neighbor, and right now I feel very uncomfortable because I think, let's say, I don't agree with the protests. I feel uncomfortable. Well, the protests aren't hurting you. God's calling us to be uncomfortable. But there's a purpose to His calling to uncomfortable lifestyles. Let's show another example. Moses, big religious figure, right? Great guy, did a lot of good things, top notch. God called him to be very uncomfortable for his entire life. Once he left Egypt and left that luxurious lifestyle, honestly, but witnessing oppression and just getting and saying, you know what, I can't deal with this oppression, I'm just going to leave it. He had the privilege to do that. God then calls him to go back and confront Pharaoh, confront the empire, confront the leader of a massive empire in the area, and tell them that your main workforce is going to be leaving you, and you're going to let them go. And Moses' first response, no, I can't do it. I stutter. God's calling him to be a speaker, and he stutters. He's calling him to be very uncomfortable. God helps people out when they're uncomfortable, but He ultimately will ask us to do very uncomfortable things, whether that is give of yourself. Don't expect things that you necessarily want. But there's, again, a purpose to this uncomfortableness. Don't be uncomfortable just because it helps one person. Don't be uncomfortable just because you feel you should be uncomfortable. God's calling us to be uncomfortable to proclaim his message. God is calling us to be uncomfortable to spread his love and his mercy and his righteousness throughout the world. Part of this is through being uncomfortable with conversations. We see a lot right now where people are very uncomfortable with conversations, so they just aren't having them. We need to be okay with being uncomfortable with conversations about how we treat other people, how our society treats and views other people. Because ultimately, what we're trying to point everyone to is that God sees us as equals. God has created us to be equals. And so we need to love each other, no matter our skin tone, no matter our sexual identity, what have you. We are to love one another. That is what God's calling us to do, and that is one of the uncomfortable conversations God's called us to do this past month. And I think if we pay attention, God's going to call us to more uncomfortable times in our futures. Not a fun message, I'll be honest, but it's one that needs to be said.
It's your turn to preach, Tag. You're it.
Well, thank you, Nick, for that passage this week. For next week, I will challenge you with Philemon verses 10 through 21. See you next week.